Okay, what's up for tonight? Yeah.
In this week's parsha, it says that Lot baked matzahs for the malachim, and Rashi says that it was Pesach. I was wondering, what is Pesach supposed to be pre-matzah Torah?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Chazal understands that, Yitzchak will be born next year on Pesach, that's known, but if you go back a year, this is 1 year before, so Light is serving the malachim matzah, and the question becomes, number one, how did they know there was a mitzvah of matzah? Now that's not a kasha, because Chazal tell us that the aveiras kept the whole Torah before it was given, so the fact that they knew there would be a mitzvah of matzah, that's not a problem. But the question becomes, what is the logic of doing that type of mitzvah? Because the Torah says beferish that the reason why we eat matzah is to commemorate the fact that when the Jewish people were left Mitzrayim, they didn't have time to let their dough rise, and they had to bake it in an unleavened state. So we want to remember the chipazon, the hurriedness, the rush, through which we left Mitzrayim. So the question becomes, the mitzvah has no sense, the mitzvah has no seichel, the mitzvah has no meaning before that event happens. See, bishlama, something like Shabbos, or something like kashrus, or something like tefillin. So even if technically those mitzvahs did not take effect till Matan Torah, one could see a spiritual reason in keeping them. So good, so the aveiras kept Shabbos even before the Torah was given. But when you have a mitzvah whose whole reason is because of a later historical Matzah, what would be the spiritual benefit? I'm just explaining your question. What would be the spiritual benefit of keeping it? Right. So that's a good kasha. In other words, it's not a kasha about Shabbos, about kashrus, about tefillin, about saying Kriya Shema. All of that is fine, but something like matzah l'chayra is a problem. So the truth of the matter is, the answer I'm going to give you is may not be the best answer in the world, but the answer is that the mitzvahs have infinite meaning, and the historical circumstance out of which the mitzvah was generated is lav dafka, the only tachlis of the mitzvah. Meaning to say, mitzvahs have independent tachlisim in terms of the tikkunim, the rectification they bring into the world, and those exist even if the history didn't happen yet. And Memela, this would be a very good example, that a person who understands the DNA of the universe, right? You all understand the famous Maimer Chazal, Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world. That means to say that the world is an expression of the godliness that's within the 613 mitzvahs. So when we say the aveiras understood the Torah before it was given, they didn't understand it by some revelation of Hashem speaking to them, but they understood it through a process that we would call today reverse engineering. We don't even understand how this works. They look at the final product of the world, and they kind of look at the DNA, so to speak, that gives rise to those realities. And they see that this reality comes from matzah, and this reality comes from Shabbos, and this reality comes from kashrus. You know, the Mekubalim say that's exactly the meaning we read a few weeks ago in Parshas Bereshis, that Adam gave names to all the animals. Now, Mark Twain has a sarcastic essay, a humorous essay, in which Eve asks Adam, he says, why did you call that thing a lion? And Adam is a little annoyed with Eve, and Adam says, it looks just like a lion, what do you want me to call it? Now, he was trying to make fun of things, but the truth of the matter is, if instead of lion we substitute the word aryeh, Mark Twain's answer is exactly that of the Arizal, meaning to say, Adam HaRishon called a lion an aryeh because he saw through like an X-ray vision that the spiritual DNA of a lion comes from a combination of Aleph, the kayach of Aleph, Resh, Yud, and Hey. The Ramban says, this is why Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh. Why is Hebrew, I don't mean modern Hebrew, but let's say the language of the Torah. Why is that called holy language? So the Rambam, Maimonides, gives a negative word because in Lashon HaKodesh, there is no pornography. There is no language expressing sexual or excretory functions. all sexual language in biblical Hebrew is euphemistic. So it'll say, he slept with her, he lay with her, etc. So it's Kadosh because it doesn't mention any of those functions that we normally are not supposed to talk about in a public way. That's why even in modern Hebrew, any profanity or obscenity that you have in modern Hebrew, and there is some, is from Arabic. That the Hebrew itself does not contain any of those words. That's what Rambam says. Ramban doesn't like that. Ramban says that's a negative reason, and he gives a positive reason, that the reason Lashon HaKodesh is called Lashon HaKodesh is because it is through the spiritual forces of the Aleph Beis and their combinations that Hashem created heaven and earth. So, the fact that a lion is called a lion has no spiritual significance. Lion is just a made-up word from something. But the fact that a lion is called Aryeh, that's because its spiritual essence is Aleph Resh Yud Hey. Now, I'm bringing this in just to show the idea that the underlying physical reality of things is based on a spiritual koach. And mitzvos bring that spiritual koach into the world. And therefore, even what you might call historically contingent mitzvos did have an intrinsic value even prior to that history. And matzah would be that example. Okay. Yeah.
If a Kohen is given a place to bench, let's say wine or grape juice, and he's had a aveiras and he doesn't want to drink it afterwards, is he allowed to give it to someone else?
Yeah. So this is So the question is, I'm always asked to repeat the question. The question is, if a person's a Kohen and it's not a Kohen, there's nothing about your question about a Kohen, right? And if anybody who's given, anyone who's honored to bench, and they don't want to drink the wine or the grape juice or whatever it will be, can they bench on the cup, and can they give the cup to somebody else to drink? Now, this is a general question that's lav dafka by benching. It also applies to making kiddush and the like. So the halacha is actually very, very clear. The halacha is that whenever you recite a mitzvah over a cup of wine or grape juice, whether it's kiddush, whether it's at a bris milah, whether it's a sheva brachos, whether it's birkat hamazon, so the halacha is that the kais shel bracha must be drunk, and that means to be zayin, as Rashi says in Eruvin. It's a denigration to the kos shel bracha that it not be drunk, but it doesn't have to be drunk by the person doing the mitzvah. So I could make kiddush, and I could give the cup to you to drink, or even divide it among the people. So birkat hamazon would be the same thing. The only thing is, in the case of birkat hamazon, where the Borei Pri HaGafen is recited at the end of benching, it would actually be best that the one who's going to drink makes the Borei Pri HaGafen. So you would lead the benching over the kos, right? You would hold the kos and lead the benching. And then when you finish, Hashem Yivarech Es Amo Bashalom, you can give the kos to somebody. They would make a Borei Pri HaGafen and they would drink. Okay, so that's perfectly fine. Now, in the case of kiddush, that's a little more awkward because the Borei Pri HaGafen is prior to the kiddush. So there we actually allow even the one who's making kiddush to say the Borei Pri HaGafen with kavana to be motzi, the person who's going to drink. Okay, so that's what you can do. Yeah.
So the Torah provides halachos of how slavery should be conducted, presumably b'di'evet. What the Torah does not do is consider it evil enough to demand total prohibition, like how it treats the worst aveiras like adultery, incest, and avodah zarah, which were prevalent at the time of the Torah, but yet the Torah did not have these aveiras despite their prevalence. Why do you think that the Torah did compromise with slavery? And technically, there's a scheme that slavery could or should be revived and be considered kosher when Eretz Israel returns to its Torah roots.
Yeah, so this is a very excellent question. Again, the question b'kitzur is that slavery is regarded by most, probably all civilized people, as something that's evil, something that's bad. And yet we find that the Torah permits slavery. Now, I want to emphasize that there are two types of slaves, right? There is what is called the Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave, and then there's called the Eved Canaani, which means Canaanite slave, but actually it's not Canaanite, it means a non-Jewish slave. Now, I want to point out that although we use the same word Eved for both, the Jewish slave is not really slavery in the way that term is understood today. The Jewish slave is simply a worker who gets room and board, etc. So that I would not raise as such a difficult problem, and be it as it may, that you cannot revive today halachically, because that requires yovel and other technicalities. So when people raise the issue of the morality, God forbid, or the immorality of the Torah, they are primarily focusing on the non-Jewish slave, because the non-Jewish slave is a slave in kind of the same way that the African was a slave, in America or whatever it is. There is a concept of slavery. You own this person, you can sell this person, you can break up a family in theory, all sorts of things. So the question becomes, how could this be? How could a Torah, which is supposed to be good and perfect and moral, how could the Torah allow slavery? So there are really two approaches. You alluded to one approach, but that's not the only approach. So you alluded to the approach that maybe slavery is a very b'di'evet institution, meaning to say, of course, it is not Hashem's will that we have slaves. Slavery is a bad thing. Slavery is an evil thing. But it was so prevalent in the ancient world. Every society had slaves. So if God were to say, thou shalt not have a slave, many people would not have been able to keep that. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a cheshbon. Let's allow it, but let's humanize it, because there are laws, you don't torture a slave and the like. And that way, better to have slavery that's regulated and humanized, and the slave is treated as more of a human being, than to simply abolish slavery where people are going to violate it and do things that are much worse. So one way of understanding this is the Torah tolerates a less than desirable institution in the hope that eventually, as indeed historically it largely has, it would just disappear. But at the time, the Torah could not make it disappear. Now, that is an approach that some people can deal with. But as you point out, the Torah was not afraid of abolishing things. The Torah abolishes, incest. It abolishes idolatry. It doesn't say let people, do it a little bit. So slavery, the Torah seems to tolerate. But let me remind you that this notion of Hashem tolerating things that he really would like to abolish, the Rambam uses that for korbanos. Remember the famous passage of the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, where the Rambam discusses the korbanos. And the question is, why does God want sacrifices? Does God like barbecued meat? Like, what's the point? So if you remember, what the Rambam says is that in reality, Hashem doesn't want any korbanos. Hashem wants prayer. Hashem wants learning. Hashem doesn't need physical sacrifices. But people were sacrificing to idols. And they were even sacrificing their children to idols. And they loved the pageantry. They loved the ceremony. So if God were to say, go cold turkey, so to speak, they would continue to go to avodah zarah, so they could have this outlet, which would include human sacrifice. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, okay, I will allow you to bring sacrifices within my framework. Only Kohanim, only special times, etc. So that's kind of a precedent. The notion that Hashem tolerates and will accept things that are suboptimal is sometimes offered as an explanation for slavery. But I'll tell you where there's a problem in that. According to that reasoning, though, it's better not to have slaves, right? That's the higher morality. So one would assume if you had slaves and you freed them, that would be a good thing to do. Meaning, if the idea is that slavery is really not good, but God tolerates it because people are not strong enough to abolish it, then l'chayra, any person who frees a slave should be doing a mitzvah. And yet, what does the Gemara say? Anyone who frees his non-Jewish servant is committing a sin. Because the Torah says, Li'olam bahem tavaidu. You have to enslave this person forever and ever. Remember, the Gemara has a famous story that Rabbi Eliezer had a slave, had an Eved Canaani, and he came to Shul, and there were only 9 people plus the eved. Now, an eved cannot count for a minyan. So what he did was, he freed his eved. He gave his eved a document of freedom, so that the eved is now a regular Jew. That's what happens when an eved Kanani is freed, and he could be counted as a minyan. And the Gemara asks, how could he free his eved? First of all, think about the Mesiras Nefesh here. I mean, an eved, from purely an economic standpoint, an eved is a valuable asset. Right? You could sell an eved for $100,000, whatever it would be. He freed the eved in order to count him for a minyan, and the Gemara asks, how is that permitted? Kol mishacher avdai over biyaseh. And the Gemara's answer is, for a mitzvah it was mutter. For a great mitzvah it was mutter. Now the question is, if you understand slavery as a concession to human weakness, then why should it be a sin to free your slave? One might say it should be a mitzvah to free your slave because you're no longer engaged in the immorality of slavery. So that would suggest that, and this is not politically correct at all, you can get in trouble for this, but that would suggest that there might actually be something positive in slavery and not just the negative. And the Netziv suggests the idea that when you were dealing with idolatrous, immoral populations, bringing them into a Jewish home where they're exposed to Kedusha and goodness, trains them, civilizes them, gives them a moral compass. And that was the idea. The idea of a slave was not to be treated like a piece of property, but to be indeed in a subordinate position. That's what slavery is, but to somehow learn to live at a higher standard. The truth of the matter is, lahavdil, this is not a raya, Aristotle uses a similar rationale for Greeks enslaving barbarians by saying, this is our gift to the barbarian, that we can raise the barbarian to a more civilized level. According to that idea, owning a slave creates a certain responsibility, right? The responsibility is to create some type of spiritual environment. But so there are two different perspectives, meaning do you look at slavery as a concession or do you look at slavery as a way of civilizing a uncivilized, idolatrous, immoral population? Now remember that the Gemara itself has one outstanding case of a slave who was considered to be even a Talmid Chacham, Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi, Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, had a slave, a non-Jewish slave, whose name was Tavi, remember? And Tavi was Chacham, he knew a lot of Torah. The Mishnah occasionally cites him for halacha, that because an Eved Kanani has the halachas of a woman, an Eved Kanani is patur from sukkah, so he slept in the sukkah with the family, but he slept under the table or under the bed, because a woman is patur min sukkah, therefore he was not mechayiv to sleep under the roof of the sukkah. And the Mishnah in Brachos says, when Tavi died, Rabban Gamliel observed the laws of mourning, not, he observed a certain aveiras. And the Gemara says, what do you mean? You don't have to sit shiva for your Evet? And he said, Tavi is not like other avadim. He's a Talmid Chacham. So the relationship is complex, and really, your question is a very, very good question. But there are different ways of viewing slavery. It's complicated. I don't want to get into stuff that civil rights and other things that can, again, get me in more trouble than I'm already get into. But, even in terms of the American experience, there were certain benefits to things like segregation and discrimination, which were lost when there was integration and freedom. For example, one particular example is, maybe I really shouldn't go there. There's no reason. But when blacks did not have freedom to live wherever they wanted to live, so even professionals had to live in the inner city. They had to live in the ghetto. They had to live in the slum. As a result, black kids who were growing up, they had role models in the ghetto of doctors, store owners, very solid people, and that created kind of a role model to look up to. When you have total freedom, what happens was all the people who could afford it, they move out to the suburbs. All you have in the ghettos are kids without fathers or whatever it is. They grow up wild. They grow up without anyone to look up to, other than drugs and everything else. And once again, you could trace a lot of the social problems actually come from civil rights. In other words, expanded freedom. Of course, that's even true for Judaism. As we get more freedom in society, we left the Torah. A similar idea there. So I'm not advocating slavery. I'm not advocating discrimination. But there is something to be said for the Nitziv's idea that sometimes being in a state of subordination can have positive benefits that strengthen character in various ways. Yeah.
So does that mean that slavery or indentured servitude has no place in future messianic Eretz Israel because the goyim in Eretz Israel are no longer idolaters?
Yes, that's a good question. Will there be slaves? When we come back to a perfect world, will there be slaves? Now, in truth, there are many, many psukim that say that the goyim will serve the Jewish people because they'll recognize their greatness. But you have a very good point. There are commentaries that say that will be a voluntary decision to serve. They're not going to be enslaved, but they will want to serve Klal Yisrael in various ways. And in that sense, I wouldn't call that slavery, because the very definition of slavery is involuntary servitude. And under those circumstances, I think you're correct. We will not have a concept of involuntary servitude. Limos Mashiach. Now, just another point that you mentioned, is it possible to reinstitute slavery today? Well, interestingly enough, halachically, I had mentioned the institution of Eved Ivri can only exist when there's the Yovel year, which we don't have. But the institution of Eved Kanaani could even exist today. So theoretically, api halacha, one would be permitted to have and own a non-Jewish slave. Again, it's against the law. You'd get in trouble. The police would arrest you. But according to the halacha, you're allowed to have an Eved. Now, this, based on a Mishnah in Kedushin, amazingly enough, has been suggested, again, it's based on a Mishnah, as a solution to the problem of someone that's a mamzer. Let's assume, God forbid, a person is a mamzer. He was born from his mother committing adultery. He's a mamzer. A mamzer is a Jew, of course. A mamzer is chayiv in mitzvahs, but a mamzer cannot marry most Jews. A mamzer can only marry a mamzeres, or a mamzer can marry a giores, okay? But either way, the kid is going to be a mamzer. So if Reuven is a mamzer, how does Reuven purify his children? How does he remove the taint of mamzer? So Rabbi Tarfon in the Mishnah in Kedushin gives us a way. If a mamzer marries a non-Jewish maidservant, the halacha is a non-Jewish maidservant child is an Eved. If I then free the Eved is like a converted Jew who no longer has the taint of mamzeres. So if a mamzer marries a shifcha, the child is an Eved. If you're meshacher the Eved, he's not a mamzer. At that point, you've ended the taint of mamzeres. So the poskim say, this theoretically could even be done today. Now, how does that work? It's going to sound very funny. A mamzer should find a non-Jewish woman. Now, a mamzer cannot live with a non-Jewish woman. That's not going to work. But he says to the non-Jewish woman, and please excuse my indelicacy, would you like to be my slave? Now that sounds a little, kinky, but whatever it is, would you like to be my slave? She says, don't worry, it's not so bad. So what does she have? What does she have to do? What she has to do is she goes to the mikveh. Actually, the truth is, a non-Jewish slave woman has the same mitzvahs as a Jewish woman, because an Eved is like an Isha, right? So she goes to the mikveh, she accepts mitzvah, she accepts the relationship of slave, so they're not halachically married, but they're living together, and they're allowed to. They have children. He then frees the children. The children are not mamzerim, right? The question is, how is he allowed to free his children? Didn't we just say that you're not supposed to free your slave? But elamai, in order that they shouldn't be mamzerim, maybe there's a heter, but it doesn't matter. The Mishnah says that the children are freed. Could he then free his wife? And just because once he's had all his kids, well, then you do run into the problem. Is he allowed to free his wife? But technically speaking, this slave relationship is actually a potential eitzah to be machshir your children, that they shouldn't have the taint of mamzeris. Now, obviously, if you think about that, that type of slavery is a slavery in name. It's not a slavery in substance, meaning you're not treating her, the idea is not to treat her as a slave. Essentially, you're treating her as a wife, but she has the shame shifcha to thereby make the children avodim, which could then be freed and not have mamzeris. So slavery itself can exist in different types of forms, and not every slavery is the slavery we think about with whips and all that other stuff. Okay, that's enough of an arichas on that issue. Anything else? Yeah.
What was the Torah world's view on the suffrage movement?
You're talking about the women.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, what is the Torah's view on suffrage? The idea of giving women the vote. Of course, that's kind of not been a live issue for a very long time. So it is very, very interesting that this actually was discussed in Eretz Yisrael under the British mandate, when women were given the vote, the right to vote in elections. So Rav Kook actually wrote different shuvos. And the truth of the matter is, it's funny, if you were to ask somebody, what would Rav Kook say? So everyone assumes Rav Kook is always going to be lenient and make whatever it is. So Rav Kook said, for sure, good idea. He actually said, halachically, it's very problematical, because we have a halacha that says melech v'lo malka, meaning to say leadership positions are supposed to be given to the men. Women are in charge of the home and the house, but leadership positions are supposed to be given to a melech and not a malka. That's why there's an issue. A woman, l'chatchila, should not be a mayor. A woman should not be a governor, etc. Even president of a shul is a big question. In a number of modern Orthodox kehilos, women are presidents of shuls, but many poskim say there's a real problem with that. So Rav Kook made the argument that when you live in a democratic society, so voters are choosing who will be their leaders, that itself is a leadership position. And therefore, now one could argue with that, but Rav Kook's argument was that giving the vote to women would be a violation of sarara, not giving leadership positions, leadership roles to women. Other poskim said it was mutter. Part of it was a fear, also of undermining shalom bias. If woman and man have different voting, it may cause machlokas. In fact, I don't know if you follow this, not that you should follow this. This was Kamala Harris's last-ditch effort. She made a commercial, very infamous commercial a little bit, where husband takes his wife to the voting place and kind of gives her a dirty look and says, honey, I hope you'll vote for the right candidate. And she says, for sure she will, meaning he's trying to force her to vote for Trump. And she goes into the voting booth and she marks the Kamala Harris, and it basically says, don't be afraid. What you do in the voting booth is your private decision. All right? So this was a commercial, mamish, don't be afraid. So anyway, but the point is that so there were two problems with women's suffrage. Problem number one was sarara, and problem number two was shalom bayis and machlokas, if they indeed take different positions. So that was discussed, and Rav Kook basically did say in a perfect Torah society, women would not be involved in politics. But here is his point, and this has been followed by every gadol. When you have a secular government that is allowing women to vote, you can't have a circumstance where religious women are not going to vote. Because if religious women are not going to vote, that's going to compromise and destroy the effectiveness of the religious community, meaning we lose our vote. We lose half of our votes. You see? Let's have a simple example. If you have, let's say, 100 non-religious men, 100 non-religious women, 100, let's just look at it this way. Now, if you're going to tell me the secular are going to vote, 200 are going to vote, 100 men, 100 women. The religious, you're telling me only 100 are going to vote. So by definition, we'll never have any political power at all. So b'chi gavne, it's a davar pashut, that if secular people, men and women, are going to vote, you have to have a system where religious people also, men and women, vote. So l'maisa, according to halacha today, all Gedolei Israel, as far as I know, other than the Gedolim who say don't participate in the state, but that's Eretz Israel. But in terms of the voting, all will allow women to vote today for that reason, even though l'chatzchila, there was some discussion about that. Yeah.
I've noticed, I don't know how to word this, how come people that have learned the Talmud for many years still are not mensch and they're not idle people on their Talmud?
Yeah. So the question is, again, I'm always asked to repeat the question. The question is that sometimes, there are many exceptions, Baruch Hashem, sometimes a person could learn Gemara, be in yeshiva, be in kollel for many, many years, but there's still an absence of good midos. They're still cruel, mean, insensitive, or whatever it would be. Isn't there an idea that the Torah should make you better? The Torah should elevate you. The Torah should have an effect on you. How is it possible that a person who learns Torah and maybe even knows a lot of Torah could have unrefined or bad character traits? Right? That's a very, very good question. So there are a few things to say. First of all, there's a famous story with Shal Salanter where somebody was proposing a shidduch and talked about a chassan, a boy, as this boy is so mitzuyan, he is so excellent, that he went through Shas a number of times. So Rav Salanter said, it's very nice that he went through Shas, but how many times has Shas gone through him? Meaning to say, he went through Shas, but Shas did not influence him. And in particular, there's a word from the Vilna Gaon that's very powerful. The Vilna Gaon points out that Torah is compared to water. Everyone knows that. Torah is compared to water. Now, why is it compared to water? So some say, water gives life and water purifies. Torah gives life, Torah purifies. Water goes from high ground to low ground, so the Torah leaves the arrogant and goes to the humble. But here's what the Vilna Gaon says. This is quite amazing. Water causes growth on whatever it comes in contact with, and water is indifferent if it's good or bad. If you pour water over wheat, you'll get wheat. If you pour water over poison ivy, you will get poison ivy. Says the Vilna Gaon, Torah will accentuate and bring out whatever is in your nature. If your nature is kind and good and gentle, the Torah will make you more kind, more good, more gentle. Now that's pashut. That's not controversial. But the second thing is amazing. He says, but if a person is cruel and arrogant, the Torah itself may make him even worse. Torah is like water. And that's why the Vilna Gaon said that limud HaTorah has to be augmented with character development, with musar, with working on your mitos. It's not an automatic thing, I learned Torah, I'm going to be a better person. You're a better person when you work and strive to be a better person. So as a result, the phenomenon that you're describing is not unknown. That there may be a lot of arrogance, there may be a lot of gaiva, and maybe the Torah learning might even make it worse because it gives a person a sense of superiority over other people that maybe had he been an Amoritz, he wouldn't have had that superiority. So that's very, very sad. And when that happens, that is almost a textbook definition of Chilul Hashem. Because what does it mean to desecrate God's name? That a person who is supposed to be a representative of Yiddishkeit, a representative of Torah, behaves in a way that brings discredit, then people are going to say, that's what Torah is. Who wants it? Why should I want it? That is Chilul Hashem. I always tell people before Bein Hazmanim, before you go home to your families may not appreciate how many Tosfos you learned this year. Maybe they will, but often they may not know. If they themselves are not people who learn Gemara, they're not going to know. Say, hey, I learned 20 blot or whatever it will be. But they will know if you're a sensitive, kind, caring person or not. And if they see that the Torah made you more egotistical, more selfish, they're going to wonder, gee, what is it that I'm paying for, or what is it that I'm allowing to happen? Is this where I want my child to be? So when a person goes back to the other world, so to speak, one has to be very, very careful in terms of their midos. Now, the final point I want to make is that some say that as bad as the person might be, maybe he would have been worse without the Torah. So you can't really compare it, meaning you're asking, oh, the person learns Torah, why is he such a bum? So some people will say, he would have been a bigger bum without the Torah. Okay, so the Torah didn't make him a tzaddik, but the Torah, made him better than he would have been. That might be true as well. But again, what you're pointing out is a very, very painful phenomenon that we sometimes see. And really all of us, I include myself, we have to work very, very hard that we should try not to fall into that category. Because if that's the case, the desecration of Hashem's name is really, really serious. Very, very bad. We have to be cognizant of it all the time. Yeah.
What happened to, do we know what story what happened to the Kotzker Rebbe?
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay, just be sure everyone knows the information. In the 19th century, there was a great Hasidic Rebbe, Rav Menachem Mendel of Kotzk. He was the Rebbe. He really did not continue a dynasty after him, but he was kind of the precursor to the Gera Rebbe and Rav Tzadok indirectly, so he was kind of like a founder of many, many dynasties. But the Kotzker Rebbe was an extremely enigmatic person. He was very sharp, very cutting. He had an uncompromising commitment to emes. And he saw in the Hasidic world a lot of things he didn't like, because he saw in Hasidus there was a lot of emphasis on chitzonios, on externalities, the way you dressed and all of that, and he hated it. He says he only wanted emes. He wanted avodas Hashem. He didn't want any of this superficiality. And as a result, he often pushed people away. People came to him for a bracha. People came to him to give him a kavit staka, whatever it was. He says, I don't want it. If you're not working on yourself, I'm not interested. And even though he had, at one point, he had hundreds of followers, thousands of followers, he said all he wanted were 10 people that he regarded as his talmidim, and he said he didn't have them. He didn't have them at all. So the end of the Kotzker Rebbe, actually not just the end, the last 20 years of the Kotzker Rebbe's life is kind of shrouded in mystery to this very day. He stopped seeing people, and he became a recluse. He shut himself up in a room, and there would still be people hanging around on the outside, because every few weeks he would come out and say, they record, he came out and said, it still stinks here. And then he went back into the room. So they would be waiting just for a word from him. He saw very, very few people. One of the few people he continued to see was his great son-in-law, the Avnei Nezer, who became one of the Gedolei Hador Mamish, and he continued to learn with the Kotzker Rebbe. So, in fact, he even said that his derech in learning is from his father-in-law, the Kotzker Rebbe. So the Kotzker Rebbe must have been an enormous Talmud Chacham, because the Avnei Nezer was recognized as one of the Gedolei Hador Mamish in halacha. So the question becomes, what exactly happened? He just withdrew. He became a hermit. He refused to see people. Sightings were very, very rare. So the answer is we don't know. And there are a lot of different theories, and articles have been written. And some of the articles were written from a non-religious or even an anti-religious bias. So you got to be very, very, very careful. Some say it was a nervous breakdown. It was literally a nervous breakdown where he was not able to cope or see people, and therefore he just went by himself. In those days, mental health was not really treated that much. Such a thing could happen. Others say there was something. Now, this is where I'm just doing this just because you might come across it, so I just want to warn you ahead of time. They say that he had a certain stage in which he was kaifer, meaning he looked at the world and he saw so much evil in the world, and he couldn't understand how God could allow this. and therefore they say he lit his pipe on Shabbos once, or he put out a candle on Shabbos, and he said, "Less din v'less dayan." There is no judgment and there's no dayan, and then he withdrew. Now, this is a favorite narrative of non-religious or anti-religious writers. So I warn you, I have no reason to believe it's true, and I don't want to impugn the zeicher of a great, great tzaddik, but this story is out there, that he had a crisis in faith. Others say, take him at his word, that he was tired of being a leader to people who he felt were living on a superficial level. He wasn't interested in the pomp, he wasn't interested in the ceremony, he wasn't interested in the tishes, he wasn't interested in going through all of the ceremonies of Chassidus. He wanted to concentrate on his own avodas Hashem, and maybe through that, in some indirect way, people would be influenced. And indeed, the truth of the matter is, the few people he saw became great gedolim of the next generation, whether it's the Avnei Nezer, whether it's the Chidushei Harim. So in a sense, he just withdrew from public. So the mystery, the story of the Kotzker is a mystery, ranging from nervous breakdown to spiritual introspection to chas v'shalom, even Chilul Shabbos. There are many, many stories. Interestingly enough, it's not the only story. You know, we have an earlier, 2 generations before, we have the Chazal of Lublin, in which, once again, he lived on the second story of a building, and he was found on the ground, dead. And once again, people are talking about suicide. You know, there's a lot of mysterious stories out there, and depending on a person's orientation, they will try to interpret the stories in different ways. So the Kotzker Rebbe is an example of that.
Sometimes Chazal want to describe an aveira as being very serious. They say it's so covered that Misa is not mechaper on it. So considering that everyone is going to die in the end, why should that make us consider an aveira more seriously?
Yeah. So the question is this. There are certain aveiras, and indeed Chilul Hashem is one of them, desecrating Hashem's name is one of them, that Yom Kippur is not mechaper, Tshuva is not mechaper, suffering is not mechaper. There is no kapara until a person dies, and this is the teaching of Chilul Hashem. There is no kapara until Misa, and this is said to be kind of to warn a person how severe it is. So the question is, well, what's so bad about that, given the fact that every person is going to die until Tchiyas HaMesim? Okay, so I know my kapara is kind of waiting for me. I hope it'll be delayed. So, but I think the answer would be that to live in a state of not having a kapara, even if you'll get your kapara when you go to Olam Haba, by own right you'll have that kapara, means you actually have a diminished relationship with Hashem in your life. Now, we can't always quantify what that means, but that means you're less connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Your mitzvos have less of a koach. Your Yetzer Tov will not be as strong as it otherwise would be. So there are real costs. Just because you're going to get the kapara at the end, it still means that there's a tremendous diminishment in your aveiras Hashem, which is why you want to avoid being in that circumstance. By the way, I think I mentioned this before Rosh Hashanah or after Rosh Hashanah, Shemei Tshuva. The Rambam statement from the Gemara in Yuma, it's from the Gemara in Yuma, that Chilul Hashem has no kapara until death. So I want to tell you 2 qualifications of that statement. The first qualification is from Rav Steinman, relatively modern, in which he said that Chilul Hashems can be big and Chilul Hashems could be little. Chilul Hashem could be that some Rosh Hashiva has been having relations with single girls. That is a pretty massive Chilul Hashem. And then a Chilul Hashem could be that yeshiva students are talking too loudly on a bus, which is also a Chilul Hashem. But it's not the worst Chilul Hashem. I mean, plenty of Israelis are talking loudly anyway. So Rav Steinman says, when the Rambam says Chilul Hashem has no kapara until Misa, he doesn't mean every Chilul Hashem doesn't have kapara, but it means Chilul Hashem can be so serious that there's no kapara to Misa, but there are Chilul Hashems that are sins, but there will be a kapara for them. That's point number one. Point number two is from Rabbeinu Yaina in Sharei Tshuva. Very fascinating point. He says, when Chazal describe devotion to Torah learning, Chazal describe it as death. And the pasuk, Zais HaTorah, this is the Torah, Adam ki yamos b'ayel, when a person dies in the tent, it's referring to Tumah, but Chazal have a drasha, Ein divrei Torah miskaimim, the Torah does not endure except for people who kill themselves. So Rabbeinu Yaina says quite logically, if limud HaTorah with great hasmada is considered to be death, so memela it'll be a kapara for Chilul Hashem, that I may miss atzmai b'yayol l'shel Torah, which is gewaldig. That's a great comfort. And then he makes another point, which is interesting. You could argue with this point. He says that you can also get a kapara for Chilul Hashem if you try to make a kiddush Hashem that is equal or greater than your Chilul Hashem. So if I did a Chilul Hashem that turned off 10 people, if I am Makadesh Hashem by bringing 10 people back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in a sense, I've undone the damage. The kasha on that, again, wasn't the question really, I'm digressing. The kasha on that is, the people aren't the same. I mean, it's not like, I turned 10 people off, so Baruch Hashem, I turned 10 people on. Well, turning 10 people on is not undoing the damage of the 10 people I turned off. Rabbeinu Yaina seems to be viewing human beings as interchangeable. I lost 10, I got 10, so on net, I'm in a good place. L'chaira, first of all, human beings are different. Every human being is an olam maleh, a complete world. And second of all, you can't calculate it based on ripple effects. When you turn 10 people off, it's not just the 10 people. It's their children. In other words, you can't just say, whatever I damaged by turning 10 people off, I fixed by 10 people on. Well, you don't really know because the ripple effects could be very, very different. Maybe the 10 people you turned off might affect, 500 people, and the other group might affect less, right? So it's a kasha in Rabbeinu Yaina, but Lamaisa Rabbeinu Yaina does say this, so it's important to be aware of those two pratim in Rabbeinu Yaina. Yeah.
So a very difficult halacha from the Torah is that a Kohen must divorce his wife if she gets raped.
Yeah.
So how do rabbis and observant Jews usually deal with this difficult issue when such unfortunate cases happen today? Given that forcing a divorce can destroy the people involved if they love each other very much, and can also ruin the lives of their small children. On one hand, you want to protect the sanctity of Kohanim. On the other hand, you could even have something that is even much worse if it spurs they end up holding the Torah responsible for breaking up their families. So how do rabbis deal with this problem?
Yeah, so again, just a little background to be sure that everybody understands this. If a woman voluntarily commits adultery, she's not allowed to remain married to her husband even if he's a Yisrael, right? That's a woman that's mizana baratzon. But if, God forbid, she was raped, that's called anusa. So an anusa can stay married to a Yisrael, right? So it's not going to affect their marriage in any way. But the Gemara says in many cases that's only true if she's married to a Yisrael or a Levi. If she's I'm just repeating your question. If she's married to a Kohen, she becomes forbidden to him even if she is an anusa, and she can't marry another Kohen either. It's not the husband. She can't marry a Kohen, and that would mean, in effect, that normally would mean they would have to get divorced, even though there was no fault of her own whatsoever. They have to get divorced, and the question would be so what does that mean? I mean, there are young children. There could be all sorts of devastating effects of a divorce. Okay, so Bishlama, if a woman did it voluntarily, willingly, okay, so in effect, she was guilty. Even that could be traumatic, but okay, we could at least understand that a little better. But if the pshat is she was raped, how is it yitachen that would be penalized. So it is a very, very tragic situation. Now, Baruch Hashem, it's not that common. I mean, the scenario that you're envisioning is not a common scenario, thank God, but it can happen in theory, and it has happened. So the basic approach is this. There are two approaches that we would try to take here. Approach number one is, how do you know? Meaning to say the following. A woman, God forbid, gets raped. Now, even if she tells her husband that she was raped, he's not necessarily obligated to believe her, because for a davar shebe'erva, to prohibit a woman on her husband, you normally need two eyewitnesses. So the way the halachic system works is that through the rules of evidence and the rules of ne'emanus, the husband would not be obligated to believe his wife. And there, in fact, that's even true, by the way, if she says she voluntarily. Yisrael, the same thing. A woman says she had an affair. Husband cannot believe her and stay married. So that would be the primary thing. Now, of course, let me point out, I'm going to be an amateur psychologist for a moment here. This creates a real dilemma in how you can maintain a marriage where the husband doesn't believe his wife suffered the trauma. I mean, imagine this. Wife says to Kohen, she files a police report, I was raped. So the husband has to say, well, honey, I really can't believe you. You must be imagining it, because if I believed you, we would have to get divorced. So I just have to assume you're lying to me. And that way we can stay married. How does that work? She suffered trauma, right? She needs comfort. She needs support. But we're creating a structure where the only way she can stay married is if the husband says she's a liar. It's a hard one. One way of getting around it psychologically is, well, honey, I believe that you believe this happened. So I know your pain is real, and I want to give you comfort, even though I don't believe it happened, but I believe that you believed it happened. Okay, I'll leave it to the psychologist to analyze if that's a modality. But in terms of bottom line, the bottom line is that through the laws of ne'emanus, there's often a way out, because you don't have eyewitnesses here. Even with police reports and everything else, that's not enough necessarily to trigger the Isser. And based on kosher witnesses, you need kosher witnesses, right? It's not likely there'll be two Orthodox Jews, who see a woman raped by a guy. Okay, so that's one practical answer. Now, another mahalach, which could often be employed, is that many people who think they're Kohanim are actually not Kohanim. If you examine their yichus and you go back. Now, this can happen even outside of marriage. This is what's called many people who are Sameach face this. This is the Baal Tshuva dilemma for a Kohen. Let's say you're a Kohen, and you became religious a little older. You became religious, let's say you're 30. So technically, you will normally go out with women who are around your age, who may also have similar backgrounds. But the problem is, if the woman had relations with a non-Jew, she cannot marry a Kohen. Or if she's divorced, she cannot marry a Kohen. Now, in a world where the woman didn't even become frum until 30, the probability that she can't marry a Kohen is very great, either divorce or she doesn't have to be a virgin. If she was with a Jew, she could actually marry a Kohen. She does not have to be a virgin. Only to a Kohen Gadol she has to be a virgin. But if she was with a guy, she can't marry a Kohen. So I got a call from a rabbi in a beis din in New York, and he was complaining to me. He says, every day I'm getting calls from Kohanim who want to resign their kahuna. They don't want to be Kohanim anymore because they think they could resign the kahuna and then they could go out with all sorts of different types of women. And the rabbi happened to be a Kohen. He says, I'm very offended. I thought being a Kohen is an honor. It's a kavod. It's a distinction. Everybody wants to get out of being a Kohen. Now, obviously, you can't resign being a Kohen. That's a davar pashut. No such thing as resigning. But we sometimes do bedika, see a person is not a Kohen. So that's another way out in which the person is not a Kohen. I think I mentioned more than once, people that are friends of our family, where a person who grew up as a Kohen was not religious. He actually married a goy, not a gioris. He married a goy, a non-Jewish woman, had children who are non-Jewish, and at some point she wanted to become frum. The non-Jewish spouse wanted to become frum. Now here's the problem. The problem is, in order for a gerus to be valid, the gioris has to accept mitzvahs. But a gioris is not allowed to marry a Kohen. Now, of course, a goy cannot marry a Kohen either. They already were living in sin. But if she wants to have a conversion, she can't be allowed to stay with the Kohen because the conversion would not be Kabbalah's mitzvahs. So the Beis Din in Chicago called her in privately, and they said, you realize that we're going to talk to Rav Moshe Feinstein, he'll give us a final psak, but you realize that there is a possibility that if you accept the mitzvahs, you will not be allowed to live with your husband, even though you have 4 children. So she broke down crying, and she said, if this is the decree of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I accept it. I accept it as my akeda. This is my sacrifice to God. So they then called in the husband, who was not religious. And they said to him, you know, if we convert your wife, you may have to get divorced. So he said, you guys are nuts. And he just left the room in a right. He was not willing to accept it because he was not becoming frum yet. I mean, he was a Jew, etc. All right. So they asked the Shaila to Rav Moshe Feinstein. So listen to what Rav Moshe Feinstein said. Rav Moshe Feinstein said, you're telling me the husband is a Kohen. How does he know he's a Kohen? Who told him he's a Kohen? His father told him he's a Kohen. Is his father Shomer Shabbos? Is his father a kosher witness? No. So Rav Moshe said, there is no evidence that this man is a Kohen. If there's no evidence that this man is a Kohen, halachically you assume he comes from a majority of the Jewish population. And most Jews are not Kohanim. So he permitted them, her to convert and stay married, with the understanding that he has no halachic proof that he's a Kohen. Amazing, amazing, amazing. The man tells me he still has nightmares. When Mashiach comes, he'll discover he is a Kohen, and then what's going to be with his wife? Okay, but I said, if Rav Moshe gave you a psak, it's for sure going to work out. Again, I'm digressing. The point I'm making is that through investigating whether a person is a Kohen, that could be another solution. So the 2 solutions are that we don't have edus on the rape, and the other mahalach is that maybe he's not a Kohen, etc. Right? You have to check that out. And by the way, the fact that a person's name is Kohen, as you understand, means nothing whatsoever, because number one, some of those names were made up in Ellis Island. You know, when Jews would come with Polish names without vowels, just an unbroken consonant, so the immigration official would call them Katz or Cohen or whatever it is, so that means nothing. And second of all, you could be a guy and have the name Cohen. Let's take a very simple example. Mr. Cohen marries a non-Jew and has a kid with the last name Cohen. Not only is he not a Cohen, he's not a Jew. So based on that, the last names mean nothing at all. So that's not a machriya. Yeah. In fact, let me just mention another thing. Even DNA testing doesn't mean anything. You know, scientists have identified a genetic marker for kahuna, that if you have this genetic marker, I don't know how they come up with this, but you are a descendant of Aaron. So you might think, oh, if I have a genetic marker, that means I'm a Kohen. Absolutely not. That does show an unbroken paternal line, but you can lose it if your mother was a guy or a divorced woman or your great-great-grandmother was that. The most you can say is, if you don't have the genetic marker, in other words, that's called a true negative and a false positive, meaning not having the marker might show you're not a Kohen, but having the marker does not show you are a Kohen. So even the DNA test cannot definitively establish you as a Kohen, although it can definitively establish you as not a Kohen. Yeah. Yeah.
In firm communities where, let's say, the husband believes, and it's obviously a Kohen. Like, are there cases where a divorce is forced?
Yes. Again, the way the Ramah puts it, based on the Gemara in Kedushin, if the husband truly believes his wife, that's why the poskim say, by the way, it is better for the wife not to tell her husband. Because once she tells the husband, then we get into an issue of whether he believes her or doesn't believe her. Until he knows, he's not mechuyev to do anything. And now, once again, traumatically, that's going to be very difficult. The woman needs support. But many poskim will say if you could keep it away from the husband. Like a woman has an affair. That's more common. I mean, rape, it's very hard to keep private. There'll be police investigations or whatever. But an affair, which it's even nogei Yisrael, a woman will often be told not to tell the husband at all, simply because otherwise you get into these problems. Yeah.
How is a person who, at a young age, in the midst of his pain, and maybe feels neglected by Hakadosh Baruch Hu, how is he expected to abide by his mitzvahs? And if he's not expected, what is he expected?
Yeah, the question is a young person who's going through difficult times, feels rejected, feels alone, has a feeling that maybe Hashem is not caring for him so much. What does Hashem expect of him at that stage of his life? Does Hashem expect him to keep the mitzvah? And how is he supposed to get the koach, the inspiration, the incentive to be able to live a religious life if he feels there's nothing he's getting on some level from Hashem at that stage? Did I summarize it? Yeah. It is a real question. And the short answer is that a person in that situation has to seek out the resources that give him chizuk, the rabbis, the teachers, the friends, the community. Meaning all of us go through times in life where we might feel that we're abandoned, and we might feel alone, and we might feel angry at Hashem because of all that we're going through. But in reality, even in the most difficult life, there is a lot to be grateful for. There's a lot to be hopeful for. But sometimes you're not going to be able to come to it yourself. This is the statement of the Gemara. Ein chavush matir atzmei mibeso asurin. A prisoner in a jail cell will not be able to get himself out of the jail cell. You need other people. So you need to find something. You need to find whether, Chabad I'll mention as an example, but whatever it will be. A yeshiva, a rebbe, and you don't need a lot of people. I mean, you just need, and it's not so easy to find, you just need the one person that can unlock you, that can liberate you, that can make you see that there's more potential in life. Because the spiritual dilemma that you're describing, you see, is not even limited to spirituality. It's going to apply to everything. It'll be a generalized depression, a sadness, an aloneness. That's going to affect dating. That's going to affect getting married. That's going to affect, everything. So you gotta, when I say you, I just mean general, whoever it is, the person has to identify ways of getting out of it to see the goodness in life. Now, it could very well be, now this is a very delicate question, it could very well be that there may be times in your life where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not expecting 100% observance. But, and I can't speak for God, I don't know, but there are certainly situations where Hashem understands what a person is going through. But even then, there has to be a mindset that there's a certain direction I'm aiming towards. Right now, I'm not able to live at that level, but I wanna be able to live at that level, and I want to move towards there. And at that point, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands, as the saying goes, life is a journey, not a destination. That, okay, I'm not at the destination, but I'm at the journey. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is machshav that journey very, very much. But I think by far the most important thing is that you find, I'm sorry, I keep on saying you, but whatever it is, a person finds a support system that gives them that chizuk. That really makes, it's really a life and death kind of difference in a person. Yeah.
how do we understand the many Sfarim that discuss the 4 elements and the Chomer Yui when we know about things like modern chemistry and the periodic table that have been proven over and over again? Was that a Greek theory that was a Greek theory that was proved long ago? Was all of that Jewish literature that discusses these 4 elements built off of that Greek theory that was proved wrong, or did the Greeks somewhat take that from a Kabbalistic idea and all this discussed in Jewish literature really means something that's not as physical as it may seem?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. The idea of the 4 elements, right? We talk about wind or air, water, dirt, fire, 4 elements, is a very, very big idea in Kabbalah, in Hasidus. Although not so much in Chazal. Chazal, in Medrash and Gemara, you actually don't find it so much, but in Kabbalah and Hasidus, certainly many, many things are miyusad on the 4 elements, and then it goes over to medieval philosophy. The Rambam talks about this all the time. And the question becomes, is this an indigenous Torah idea, or is it from the Greeks? Because the truth is, Greek philosophy was very much based on these 4 elements. And the question becomes, did Torah sources get it from Greek? Or did Torah sources develop it independently, and maybe the Greeks got it from Torah, but it's a fundamental of Torah? And how do you reconcile the idea that all matter is comprised of mixtures of the 4 elements when now we understand atoms and molecules and the periodic table and the like, and we don't necessarily say everything is comprised of mixtures of air and dirt and water and fire. It is a very, very excellent question. I do believe actually that the origin of this idea is Greek. I don't think necessarily that it is fundamentally in Torah, and that is indeed why, as far as I know, I have to be careful because my Bekias is not very far from all-encompassing, but I don't believe in Medrash or Gemara there is a mention of the 4 elements. It is in the Zohar, it's in Kabbalah, it's in Hasidus, and it's in Rambam and other works of philosophy. But one way of understanding it is that there can be spiritual ideas in these symbols that don't really depend on the science that's involved, meaning the power of fire, the power of water, the power of wind, the power of dirt. They represent certain spiritual forces in the world. So Chazal, or not Chazal, but these different sources may have used the Greek scientific structure to express these spiritual ideas, but the ideas retain their validity even if the structure is not the way a scientist would talk today. You see what I'm saying? So there can be a spiritual meaning to ideas even if they're not scientifically accurate depictions of reality. But it is a good question. There's a lot in Kabbalah. In fact, the whole Kabbalistic system has been described as a form of Neoplatonism, meaning there's a lot of intersection between some Kabbalah and Plato, and obviously the question is, who influenced whom. But even so, I'll tell you, even if certain ideas entered Judaism through Greek culture and philosophy, that doesn't mean it's treif. Remember that Yavan is a son of Yefes, Noach's 3rd son. And when Shem and Yefes covered up Noach's nakedness, they walked backwards to cover him up. Noach gave Yefes a bracha. And the bracha was, Yaft Elikim liyefes. God should give beauty to Yefes, who is the father of Yavan. V'yishkain v'yaldei Shem. And Yefes will dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, in English, that sounds bad, tents of Shem, but tents of Shem is good. Shem is ben Noach, is monotheism, Kedusha. And Rav first says that Yefes was blessed with philosophy and very deep understandings, and those understandings have a place within a Torah framework to dwell within the tents of Shem. In fact, we're not coming up to Hanukkah, but Hanukkah will be in a bit more than a month. And Hanukkah we always talk about as the struggle against Yavan that tried to destroy us. But the struggle is a little more complicated than we sometimes think. It's not that Yavan bad, Torah good. Rather, Yavan is bad when it tries to undermine and destroy Torah. But there is also valuable wisdom that can be extracted and applied in avodas Hashem. So I think even if ideas entered through Greece, that would be a kiyum of Yafta Lekim Liefes V'Yishkain B'Ol Hashem. Yeah.
I recently was watching a video of Rav Ovadiah Yosef
Yeah.
on his opinion on Sheitels, and he smashed it down very quickly, and he said he brought down all the poskim and all the acronym or whatever on it, and he was saying it was like a sin and everything like that. So I'm trying to think, how are the Ashkenazi poskim supposed to, like, differentiate between the
Yeah. I once saw a video, I think it was at a chuppah. Rav Ovadiah held that the kaishel bracha shouldn't have sugar. The wine shouldn't be sweetened. So he drank like a cup of sweetened wine. I think he spat it out, and he said, "This is zelo yayin, zeh syrup. This is raspberry syrup. This is syrup, not wine." So, listen, Rav Ovadiah. I'm not in a position where I can say anything. Rav Ovadiah was a phenomenal gadol, unmatched greatness in psak halacha. In fact, I'll just tell you a little story. Bar Ilan University produced a CD-ROM, and now it's a computer program, which kind of indexes 900 volumes of Shelos Utshuvos, and you can do searches, right? It's a responsa database, a huge responsa database, which they update all the time. And when they first came out with it, like 25 years ago, they wanted to test how accurate it was. Did it come up with all the references? So they submitted the inquiry to the computer, to the program, and they submitted it to Rav Ovadiah Yosef. Rav Ovadiah Yosef came up with 10 Mara Makomos, and the CD-ROM came up with 9. So they were boasting in their advertisement. We are such an excellent program, we came up with 90% of what Rav Ovadiah Yosef came up with. Right? That was a boast. They were boasting. That's how good we are. So Rav Ovadiah Yosef was quite literally, he was a great tzaddik also. A great tzaddik. I don't want to just say he was in learning, but he was a human computer. He just knew everything. So who am I to, I can't say anything at all. But once again, but he had a certain style. He had I shouldn't compare it, that kind of a Donald Trump style in a class, I shouldn't compare it, but kind of a brash style, an open style, a confrontational style, etc. So he had a certain way of presenting his ideas, in which, he can sometimes imply that any other opinion is amaratzos, is ignorance, or the like. But the truth is, a lot of what he said, in Eretz Yisrael in particular, a lot of Ashkenazi Gedolim do not approve of Sheitels. So the truth is, it's not only a Sephardic thing in Eretz Yisrael, it's an Ashkenazic thing, but it's also true that in America, they are much more makel. The Ashkenazim are much more makel on Sheitels. And like anything else, it's machlokas and halacha, so we don't really pay attention to the rhetoric. We don't pay attention to the style. We pay attention to the substance. And the substance, you have machlokim. You analyze sources in different ways and come up with different conclusions. Okay, so we don't really worry. Rav Ovadiah talked a certain way, and people enjoyed it. He gave many shiurim, but his most famous shiur was Motzei Shabbos. He gave a shiur, but it was like 90% shiur, but 10% comedy routine. He would go through. He would make fun of Ashkenazim all the time. He would talk about Ashkenazim. For Parshat Zachar, they talk about Amalek. He said they don't know how to. He says Amalek, Maza Amalek. He would mock Ashkenazim all the time. That was part of the good-natured ribbing that went on. Yeah.
Gilgul, I always thought it was almost like an ikar of Judaism, specifically on understanding suffering, specifically suffering that's that we can't explain, like a baby or whatever. Maybe it's a gilgul, etc. So I was quite shocked to hear, I think I heard it from the rabbi, that is it Rav Sadia Gaon that says there's no such thing.
Yeah. So the idea of So the idea of gilgul is reincarnation. that your neshama may come back in this world before resurrection of the dead in different bodies. And that, of course, creates a gazillion different types of problems. Which one comes back for Techiyas HaMezim? All of those questions, etc. So gilgul, of course, was a big yesod of the Mekubalim, particularly the Arizal, and Rav Chaim Vital, who wrote all of the teachings of the Arizal, has a whole sefer called Shar HaGilgulim, which explains the complexities of gilgul and the like. So certainly among the Mekubalim it was a foundation of faith, but even earlier than the Arizal, the Ramban, who was also a Mekubal, the pre-Ari, the Ramban also goes with gilgul. And in fact, in his commentary to the Sefer Iyov, he uses gilgul as an explanation, exactly as you said, of suffering. Why do righteous people suffer? The answer is past lives and the like. It's a kapara for things they may have done in their past lives. So certainly gilgul is part of the mainstream Jewish belief, but it is not an article of faith. It's not Ikar Emunah. And many say, although Rav Sadia Gaon is a little more ambiguous than you might think, but many say that Rav Sadia Gaon in Emunos V'Deos considered gilgul to be a foreign idea that was not even Jewish originally. He did not believe in the idea of gilgul. And the Rambam doesn't reject gilgul, but the Rambam never mentions gilgul. So I think we have to assume if he doesn't mention such a thing, then probably he did not consider such a thing. So really, it is a machlokas. It is a machlokas. Now, obviously, it's an important machlokas, like what's the halacha? I'm not sure if we can talk about halacha and something like this, but is there gilgul, is there not? The answer is most Shitos say there is, but there were those who deny such a thing. And they have other explanations for why bad things happen to good people. That's a whole other miksaya. So if a person does not believe in gilgul, we cannot call him an apikairis. We could say he's wrong. We could say that's not the majority view of things, but he's not an apikairis. He's following Rav Sadia Gaon. He's following the Rambam. So we can't. There are a lot of things that are part of Judaism's overall belief system, but you're not a kaifer if you don't agree with it. Right? You might be mistaken or whatever. Yeah.
What does the Rav think about the Charedim who have 13 or 15 kids but cannot financially support them? Is it a mitzvah to bring children into the world into such an environment? Is an inability to financially support additional children a reason to use birth control?
Yeah. So the question was asked is about Charedim. Usually Charedim who have very, very large families, and they're not able to really support their children. They have to gather at tzedakah or whatever. Is it mutter, is it proper to bring children into the world if you will not have the ability to adequately support them? So it reminds me a little bit of a story about a woman who was boarding a bus, very, very exhausted, laden with packages, and she had to take 10 children, young children, up on the bus, and she was so exhausted when she finally did it, and the bus driver said, and the woman said, I'm sorry for holding up the bus. I'm just so tired with all of my children. So the bus driver said, why don't you leave half of them at home? And she said, I did. Okay. So it depends how you're asking me the shaila, meaning if somebody were to ask, you're asking the shaila kind of the opposite of the way I usually get the shaila. If you would ask me, do we have a heter after a large family not to go weiter, to have birth control because we can't afford it? There may be grounds for that. But your question is proceeding in the opposite way. We want to have kids. So the question is, are we allowed? Is it proper to bring in kids? So the truth of the matter is, it's a hard question, but I think optimally, you have to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give you the wherewithal. Now, you have to be responsible. You have to try to make your shtadlus. You got to try to figure out a budget. And even if it means you're going to get stuck, we would not tell a person, oh, you're poor, therefore don't have kids. That's not a cheshbon. It's a mitzvah to have children, and then there's a mitzvah to try to support your children, for sure. But we're not going to tell you, don't have a child because of financial difficulties. Now, what was a little tricky is that financial difficulties can very easily slide into psychological difficulties. If people don't have enough money for their families, there can be depression. There can be anger. There, God forbid, could be abuse. Now, that's very different. When a person enters the red zone, then yes, a Rav would tell him, you got to stop right now, because this is dangerous, this is no good, this is destructive. But if and maybe that's going to be true in most cases, that it's not just going to be a financial problem, it's going to be an emotional problem. And that's very serious. But if it is purely a financial problem, where am I going to go with the money? But it's a loving family, it's a close-knit family, we care about each other, it's a bias without anger, I would not say stop having kids because money will be tight. Somehow it'll come out okay. You see what I'm saying? So I'm differentiating between, maybe unrealistically, a pure money problem versus something that shades into abuse, anger, resentment, and the like. So the latter, I think, is a warning system and a very legitimate reason to at least get a psak or talk to a HaRav about stopping. But pure money, I would say, generally is not a justification. Yeah.
Does Torah address the dilemma on beating your kids?
Beating your kids?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does the Torah address the issue of hitting your children? Well, the most famous is actually not a verse in the Torah, it's a verse in Mishlei. Chosech shivto, sonei beno. And many people know this in the English translation. Spare the rod and hate the child, meaning he who withholds the rod, the stick, hates the child. Meaning you got to give your child discipline, you got to give him hadracha. But the Vilna Gaon explains the following idea. The Vilna Gaon explains that God forbid we're not talking about taking a lead pipe, and hitting your kid over the head. There's no mitzvah in doing that, and that's a very, very serious aveira. The Vilna Gaon talks about beating him with a shoelace, so to speak, meaning this is kind of a symbolic idea, just so he understands that the world is not hefker. So the truth of the matter is the Torah would not be in favor of what we would call actually hurting or hitting a child. The Torah is in favor of discipline, and the discipline is given with love. Chazal have a beautiful expression that the right hand, which is the stronger hand, should draw someone near, and the left hand, which is the weaker hand, pushes the person away, meaning there got to be discipline, but the predominant emotion has to be love. Now, in Europe it was true. In Europe it was true that parents did hit children. And they took it, that was part of life. Again, not abusively, but they hit children. In fact, even Rebbe's in Cheder. In fact, some of the people who left the derech, they talked about the strap that was on the nail, whatever it would be. And some of those Rebbe's may have gone too far. But Rav Ovadiah writes, Rav Ovadiah, one of the great contemporary Bali Musar, says, in our generation, physical hitting is not the right thing to do, because we are a weaker generation, and children will feel Children will feel resentment, they will feel hatred. So I think when you read these psukim about hitting your child, the message you get is children need guidance, hadracha, discipline, and structure. But not that they need the actual hitting. I mean, this is what Rav Ovadiah says. That's even what the Vilna Gaon says. By using the idea of hitting him with a shoelace, we're talking about symbolic hitting, symbolic discipline. So we would not be in favor of hitting today. Yeah.
Going back to his question regarding birth control,
Yeah.
would it be mutter lefi Rabbeinu Tam's shita of there's the second mitzvah of to be with your wife besides for perusal?
Well, you are very, very correct that Rabbeinu Tam understands that marital relations alone, even without children, is a mitzvah. That's very important. Rabbeinu Tam's proof is very simple, and that is that one is allowed to have marital relations with a woman post-menopause or a woman without a womb. Right? We're not going to call that wasting of seed, because it is the marital relationship itself that is constructive and holy. Right? So that's 100%. That's a very important part of Jewish understanding, that it is the chibur of ish fi ishtay that is intrinsically considered to be good, even if it doesn't lead to children. However, even like Rabbeinu Tam, that doesn't automatically lead you to the conclusion that where you can have children, as he's being machadesh, that if you can't have children, there's still a mitzvah. But when you can have children, you still have that other obligation, which can again I'll emphasize, it can be nitcha, particularly after you have a son and a daughter, which is the basic pruervu. It can be nitcha for psychological reasons, and again, obviously there will be many cases where a couple will be advised not to bring more children into the world. 100%, meaning we're not taking the position, have kids no matter what the cost. I was just suggesting, though, that pure economics would not be the factor. Hashem will give you the parnasa one way or the other, but the emotional stresses is very, very relevant. Okay, one more question or finished? Okay, all right, be well, yeshkoach, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.